Good evening, Adam. How are you doing?
I'm not too bad, I have to say. It's not too bad at all. How are you?
Well, yeah, the sun is shining. It's actually a little bit hot and stuffy in here.
I mean, it's midsummer. This is midsummer day, and it's finally
I know.
summer. It's taken half a summer to get here. But
it has taken a little while. It's only a week or two ago we were complaining how cold it is. So it's very British for me now to be complaining that it's too hot. All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak to little old me. I am, as will become clear, hopefully, as I go through. I have long been a reader of science fiction, but I am finding, since mucking about with this channel, that I have found many well-storied, literally authors that I'd never heard of, never mind read anything by, and you are in that company, and you're in good company. There were amongst the other authors that were in that category were Robert Silverberg, for example, and Paul McCauley, Dave Hutchinson, and plenty of others that I'd never mind the Americans that had somehow passed me by. Anyway, we'll come back to that. So I have been gradually both collecting, and you can maybe see them arrayed behind me here. Your various books. I don't quite have them all, but I'm getting there. At least the science fiction now. All right. So your science fiction, unusually these days at least, is almost all singletons or standalone novels, which is refreshingly old-fashioned of you. Is that I imagine that's a deliberate choice, or is that just a matter of practicalities, or do you actively prefer that? What's behind that decision?
Yeah, I don't know if it was ever a conscious decision to do that. As you say, it's kind of unusual, and it's commercially not very canny. It's better to do a big series of books where people get, I was going to say suckered in, but that's a rather negative way of putting it. They get drawn into your story. They have to keep buying volume after volume. And I've never done that. And I think I might say it's because I get bored quite easily, and I just don't want to spin out the same story over and over again. But I am also, I think, interested in, without sounding too pretentious too early on in the chat, I'll get to being properly pretentious later when we
good.
warmed up. I am kind of interested in kind of the fragmentation. The possibilities of science fiction are so multifarious. There are so many ways in which you can do it, and so many premises and exciting ideas, but also that it comes out of a tradition, the golden age and pulp science fiction, kind of short stories. And then in the 50s, there was what they call fix-ups, where people would, like Asimov would take a bunch of short stories and fix them up into what was kind of a novel, but it was still quite fragmentary. It was still quite kind of vociferous, and I'm kind of interested in that and kind of assembling things in that slightly unusual way, perhaps.
A. Van Vogt was another one that I'd never heard of, by the way.
Really?
So, well, I know. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. No, you're very much so. Yeah. It's to my to my current joy, but my past detriment that happened. I don't know. I read quite a bit of science fiction over the years, but quite a narrow range, it turns out. But I'm
just who are you reading then, just out of interest?
Right now,
who were you reading?
So I read a lot of Asimov, Golden Age all the way through to his sort of stuff from the 80s, and then Frank Herbert, read quite a bunch of Dune stuff, and then because I was of an age when the first Dune movie came out, so I read the tie-in and then read the rest of the books, and then Larry Niven and his friends was another Arthur C. Clarke I read quite a bit of. So some of the high notes I'm trying to think now. And then more recently I've enjoyed some of the more kind of commercially popular stuff like Alistair Reynolds and Peter Hamilton and Ken MacLeod is somebody I've recently picked up. Ian Banks was one that I've enjoyed a lot over the years.
I mean, these are all good names. I mean, Asimov is quite an interesting case because he's doing the exact opposite of what I was suggesting. He starts out writing lots of different stories, and then towards the end of his life, he became obsessed with the idea that all his stories had to fit into one.
They had to tie together, one big story.
The Foundation universe, which has no robots in it, and then the robot stories, which don't have the Foundation in it, they have to somehow be part of the same universe. And he really tied himself into pretzel shapes, trying to work that through into novels.
Indeed, although teenage me was quite pleased that he did. I enjoyed the way I thought it was quite neat the way it all tied together. Commercially not savvy, but you like the possibilities. So I sort of half imagined you have a long list of kind of science fiction kind of ideas or tropes or themes or something that you're gradually kind of checking off. You've done your one that's a little bit like Dune, that's Salt, and then there's the Stone's got a touch of the culture to it, I thought. And
I think that's right.
I don't know if that's true or not. And then of course there's On, which reminded me a little bit of Inverted World, just from the sort of topsy-turvy premise of the thing. But so like I say, I imagine you have a list, but I'm sure that's not the case.
No, that's kind of pretty much is the case. I mean, it's not necessarily a literal list that I'm going through with a blue pencil, but I am, it seems to be a shame not to do a time travel story, not to do a space opera, not to do a dying Earth. The Inverted World is very perceptive, because Chris Priest was one of the main kind of inspirations for me. I was reading him as a teenager, and the way I write now has quite a lot to do with reading Chris's work all the way through. So my new novel coming out is also kind of it's not a plagiary, that would be very harsh, but it's also indebted to Inverted World, which I remember reading as a teenager and being kind of blown away by.
Christopher Priest is also on my list of shame that I'd never heard of until the last couple of years. So I've been enjoying kind of hoovering up his books as well. So Inverted World was one that I read last year, actually, and really enjoyed it. I need to read it again, I think. But so I gather, skipping ahead to a later question, actually, but since you mentioned it, that your new book is, which we will talk about a bit later, is dedicated to Christopher Priest. Is that right? Yeah, and I mean, as I say, I grew up reading him, and then after all his early novels, every time there'd be a new Chris Priest book, I'd buy it and I'd read it. And then when I was published, I met him at a publishers do, and he was just fantastically, friendly and supportive, and I got to know him a little bit. And I asked him, do you mind if I dedicate my new novel to you? And he was quite pleased by that, I think. But then sadly he died earlier this year. And very much so, very sadly.
So now it has to be dedicated to the memory of Chris Priest, which is quite grievous, but he was apparently working on something while he was ill, so I don't know whether it was finished enough to be published, or someone else would finish it, or what. I don't know what it was. It was. I can tell you. If you're interested, I can tell you what it was.
Yeah, very much so.
It was a book about J.G. Ballard.
Okay.
It wasn't a fictional work necessarily. I mean, I think he's coming up to. I mean, Airframe, I think, is a really remarkable kind of late novel. But then he was working on this non-fiction title about J.G. Ballard, and there are kind of parallels with Ballard and Priest, I think, as writers, but also important differences. And I don't know what state it's in. I don't know how far he got before he lost, or if anyone's going to finish it. Yeah.
All right, then, at the risk of asking you to pick your favourite literary child, which of your, I don't know how many, I lost count, 20-odd science fiction novels is your personal favourite, and why?
Yeah, I think probably The Thing itself. I think that was it was quite a long kind of gestation writing that. It was quite complicated, and it did manage to blend these two things that I really love. On the one hand, the pulp schlocky science fiction horror, because it's kind of a riff on John Carpenter's The Thing, which I think is a great movie, and does all the kind of exciting, kinetic, wonderful, kind of thrilling, horrifying things that science fiction pulp can do really well. On the other hand, it's kind of a riff on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. It's a sort of novelization of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, quite kind of carefully worked through. And I wondered about mashing those two things together and whether it would work. And I think of all my novels, I think it's the one where it comes closest to achieving what I was setting out to do.
Oh, really? Okay. And it suffered the injustice of being one of the few of your books, I think, that wasn't published in hardback. I think I'm right in saying.
Actually, no, that's right. It was published in hardback.
It was a paperback original. Yeah. I know, because I spent quite a long time trying to find it in hardback before realizing that there wasn't.
Was that, as a collector, you prefer a hardback?
Well, so it depends. I've got like a ton of good old-fashioned A format paperbacks. But I have latterly, and I'm quite happy collecting those too. But I do like a hardback for I'd like the heft of them, and I like the dust jackets, and they are a bit of a bugger to look after. But so I have grabbed all of yours that I could find in hardback. I've got if they were published thus, and then I'm gradually buying it whenever I can find them for not ridiculous amounts of money, mainly books from like 70s and 80s and maybe into the 90s that I missed first time around.
I did a project where Anthony Burgess, the British writer, he had an incomplete kind of novel idea, but it was a historical novel about the 100 Years' War. There we are, you see.
That one. I haven't read it, so I'll confess, but I do have it.
Black Prince. And I was in contact with the Burgess Estate and the Burgess Institute in Manchester, which is run by Andrew Biswell. He's a really excellent expert Burgess scholar, and he's in charge of this really well-funded institute, which is there to maintain Burgess' reputation and to proselytize and so on. And he was I collaborated with them and was given all the materials, and I completed this novel along the lines that Burgess intended. And that was fun, and I've always admired Burgess, and that was very exciting for me to do that. But the reason I say that is I went up to the Burgess Institute in Manchester for a kind of launch event, and I came up earlier in the day, and they showed me around the kind of underground area where all of Burgess's books are part of their archive now.
Yeah.
Most of Burgess's books were just crappy paperbacks from the 70s.
Really?
And they're kind of all falling apart now because they're not built to make those paperbacks.
No.
And there was something a bit kind of, I don't know, you're thinking, clearly Burgess wasn't bothered. He'd buy lots of paperbacks, or he'd be sent lots of paperback books for review or whatever, and he'd read them really quickly and he'd bend all the spine and stuff. But it's not.
Well, there's an argument that the important thing is the words in between the covers.
Yeah.
But I think I can't remember who said it now, or if it's just apocryphal. But the reading books and collecting them are two different hobbies.
Yeah.
And I do a bit of both. And I'm only in the last couple of years am I buying books because I might like to have them rather than read them. Although there is a definite overlap of those two things. No, I like a bit of. I haven't read any for a little while now, so I've been mainlining science fiction for the last year or two. But I went through a phase of reading quite a bit of historical fiction, so I will get to the Black Prince at some point. So the thing itself, okay, favorite book. And which of yours would you recommend to someone reading their first Adam Roberts? The same book or a different one?
No, I don't read any of my books. Just buy it. As long as you buy a copy, that's all I care about. In fact, buy multiple copies of every title, and then I don't care whether you read them or not. I don't know. It's hard for me to say really, because I don't deliberately write a book to be rebarbative or off-putting. The book of mine that's done kind of best, the only one of my titles that's ever won any award, for instance, was Jack Glass. And I think Jack Glass is, if it's a golden age science fiction story, but it's also a kind of murder mystery. Yeah, it's 3 murder mysteries folded together.
It's also got a really great cover.
Yeah, it has got a great cover. I think it has the best of all my covers. I
think it might be my favourite. Yeah, it's this one here. Yeah,
but that might be the one.
Yeah. I do, but that's rather trivial of me to say that. But I haven't actually read that one yet. I've read. I've confessed now. What have I read? I've read not in this order. I have read. Where are they? Stone on. I haven't read Salt yet. I have read Land of the Headless. I read that earlier this month. Really enjoyed that. And then I have also read. How's it gone? Purgatory Mount. But that years ago, before I knew you were you, and I hadn't made the connection in my head, and I confess that I don't remember a huge amount about. Wow, lost the use of the English language. I don't remember a huge amount about it, so I will read. I probably have to reread that one. But yes, I'm gradually chewing through them from both ends.
The challenge I set myself with Jack Glass is it's a whodunit. So when you write a whodunit, it's and I've written a number of sort of whodunits, all in the science fiction idiom. You want the kind of payoff at the end to be a surprise. Obviously, if it's too obvious who the murderer is, then that's not satisfying. And if it's too obscure, if you get to the end, you think, how can I possibly have ever guessed that? It's going to be somewhere.
Well, then you've played a trick on the reader, which isn't.
Yeah, and that's not very satisfying. So with Jack Glass, what I did was I say at the beginning who the murderer is, and in fact, it's there in the title. That's who the murderer is. But I've constructed it. If I've done it right, I've constructed it in a way where it's still a surprise at the end.
Okay.
And I was kind of intrigued by that as a kind of technical challenge, just to do a whodunit.
Yeah, well, no.
If you get around to reading it, you can tell me whether it works or not.
Well, I will definitely read it. I'm enjoying making my way through your oeuvre, if I may. So you are a busy chap, it seems. So a science fiction scholar and critic as well as an author, and I imagine that you've read more than your fair share of science fiction over the years. What science fiction have you read recently in the last, I don't know, couple of years or something that you'd recommend to other people? What might I have missed?
So over the last couple of years, I read a lot of science fiction. I'm still, I love science fiction. I read it all the time. I review it quite a lot. I've been on, prize awarding committees and so I get through a lot. So it's hard to pick out stuff. I can tell you what I've been reading the last few weeks.
Okay, perfect.
The last few years. Although having said that, I don't know if this is going to be of any use to you, because a couple of things I've read because friends have written them. So this may be another series of names to add to your list of shame, and I don't mean to shame you.
Could be. No, that's right. I'm open about it.
There's Will Wiles, who's a British writer who has he's written a number of really good kind of mainstream literary fiction titles, and he most recently has written a big fantasy novel called The Last Blade Prince, which is really, really good. And he's given that he doesn't have a background really in writing fantasy or science fiction, it's an amazing achievement. So he's now written a follow-up to that, which is called The Dead Man's Empire. And because he's a friend of mine, I'm reading that at the moment in manuscript, which gives me the drop on everybody else. Otherwise, books that are actually out. So I don't know if you've got onto Adrian Tchaikovsky. He's probably the biggest name working today.
There's someone that's even more prolific than you.
Yeah, no, he is genuinely a bit scary, and that's not just because of his enormous eyebrows. His eyebrows are something else. If you meet him in person, it's like his eyebrows.
Look out for them.
But he's an amazing writer, and I'm reading his new one, which is called Service Model, which is a kind of robot-y sort of story. Yeah. And that's the thing I like about Adrian. I mean, I know him a little bit. We're not close friends with him. But
in this broken binding package is a copy of Service Model, but I haven't opened it yet. I'm delayed gratification. I'm leaving that where it is for a while. But yes, I haven't read it yet.
He's a master of a whole range of different idioms and styles, and he just seems to be able to do anything. And he's the most brilliant storyteller.
Yeah.
I also recently read. I'll tell you what. Sorry, you say.
Well, I was just going to say, I find so it would be too strong for me to say that I find him a bit hit and miss. Some of his books are really good, and others are excellent. And
I think that's fair, actually. Yeah.
There's not a bad Tchaikovsky book is still a pretty good book. I read, and maybe it was a mistake for me to well, it wasn't a mistake. I think if I had my time again, I would probably read them in the reverse order. But I read Cage of Souls last month, which I've been meaning to read for ages, which I really enjoyed. And then I read one from earlier this year, Alien Clay, and it reminded me quite heavily of Cage of Souls. There were some aspects of it that felt a bit reused, if I can put it that way. And it didn't annoy me at all. I enjoyed reading it, but I think had I read them the other way around, enjoyed Alien Clay more than I did. And I did enjoy it.
Yeah. I've also recently read China Mieville.
Yes.
You read much of him. And the interesting thing about China is, again, a really, really talented writer who hasn't published a novel in, I think, 12 years. He published a whole string of novels in the noughties, in the first decade of the century. And it's not that he stopped writing; he was writing other kinds of stuff, and he's written some histories and so on. But now he's got a new novel out that he co-wrote with Keanu Reeves.
I've seen that. I don't have it, but I saw that someone raving about it, or that
it's not out yet. So I got a copy because I reviewed it for the Guardian.
Yeah, they would have had an arc, I think. But yes, so I've read Perdido Street Station, and I've read City in the City, and of the ones that I have, the one I want to read next is Embassy Town. Yeah,
Embassy Town's really good. I mean, I think City in the City is his masterpiece. I think that's an amazing.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, it reminded me a lot, actually, of in a good way, of the Dave Hutchinson Europe books. Yeah, I don't know if you've read those. So that in the sort of juxtaposition of one place on top of another, and I can't forget which will have come first now. Probably the Mieville book, but I did enjoy that. Perdido Street I need to read again. I think I did read it a number of years back and enjoyed it, but I think I'll probably get more from a second read, I think. But so many books, so little time. Don't have much time for rereads, really. I'm glad you like Dave Hutchinson's Europe. I think he's a brilliant and underrated writer, Dave Hutchinson. Yes, he is, and we will talk about him a little bit later. So, science fiction. as you say, you've got fingers in lots of pies in the science fiction department, and I wonder what, you know, some folks kind of hark back to past years when science fiction might have been considered to have been on its way up, and now I think it's on its way down, or it's playing second fiddle to fantasy in a way that it never did in the past. And I wondered what your thoughts are on the state of science fiction currently. Is it thriving, or is it circling the drain and on its way out?
No, I think it's thriving, but I think it's thriving in a particular sort of way. So I'm old enough to, I fell in love with science fiction before Star Wars came out. So I was already a kind of massive science fiction fan, and then Star Wars happened. And I think it's hard to deny that science fiction kind of shifts its center of gravity. What used to be, you know, primarily a literary form, short stories and novels, literature of ideas, often becomes cinematic, and latterly kind of televisual and video game form, which is about the visual spectacular. Star Wars is, Star Wars is a great movie, but it's not a movie about ideas. It's a movie about you know, images and great special effects. And it is, but the success of Star Wars meant that the 80s, the 90s were just dominated by science fiction cinema. And if you look at a list of the top 20 highest grossing movies of all time, almost all of them are science fiction or fantasy. And that kind of remains the case, especially if you bracket, for instance, the Marvel Comic Universe movies as science fiction, which I think they kind of are really. Then it's been decades when science fiction has become the global kind of mainstream. So it's hard to see it circling the drain. And it's also true, I think, that, again, what used to be predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly a form of literature written by white men, you know, in Britain and North America, is now a properly global literature that's being written by all sorts of people from all sorts of different.
And that can only be a good thing, I think.
I think it is really very much a good thing, and it's fascinating to see, like, Chinese science fiction is a massive deal now.
African too.
Absolutely.
There's a bit of a generalization to say African, as it's a rather large place. But
Africa's not a country, is it? It is an entire
country. It's really
right. Brilliant writers, either African writers or writers of African heritage, who are producing amazing, you know, science fiction. It's renewing itself, I think. So I wouldn't say it's circling the drain, but then I'm a little bit biased because I still love it, and the older I get, the more conscious I get that the 14-year-old boy inside me just hasn't really grown up, and I'm still a kind of super accurate anyway.
Tell me about it.
Stuff.
Well, talking of which, good segue. So my first science fiction reads were probably Jules Verne, when I was very much still in short trousers, I think. Followed, aged about 10, by not this actual copy, because the actual one's long gone, but this is a very one very much like it. It was a Marks and Spencer's omnibus edition, which includes 2001 iRobot, Day of the Triffids, and The Demolished Man. So that was quite an introduction to science fiction proper, and I've never looked back. So I am. So do you recall what your first science fiction read was?
My gateway drugs. I think it was probably sort of slightly left field. Also kind of continental, the Tintin adventures.
Oh yes. Okay.
So some of the Tintin adventures are kind of, you know, just action adventure, but some of them are science fiction, like where Tintin and Captain Haddock fly to the moon, for instance, or where various other kind of fantastical things come in.
Quite Vernian, in fact.
Yeah. Well, I've read a lot of Jules Verne, and I've translated Jules Verne, and I wrote a sequel to one of Jules Verne, so I do love Jules Verne. No, what I remember most is I read, like you, I think I read Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke and Philip K. Dick, just whatever paperback science fiction. Frank Herbert, I read Dune. I was obsessed with Dune. I would get my pocket money and I would go into town to W.H. Smith's, which was the only, you know, the source for lots of things, and buy science fiction, whatever they had. And then for a long time I read nothing else. And it was from there that I sort of diversified into reading other forms of literature.
It's not dissimilar for me, although I did stray for a little while into fantasy territory and also a bit of horror. Science fiction kind of waned for a while, and then I picked it back up again, probably in the late 90s. But it never completely went away. I just I majored on other stuff for a while.
I had a talking book back in the days when a talking book meant cassette tapes.
Suitcase full of tapes, yeah.
Yeah, of The Hobbit, read by Michael Williamson, which I listened to over and over and over again. And from The Hobbit, I graduated to reading The Lord of the Rings, and I read The Lord of the Rings at a really quite a young age.
Yeah.
And then for a time, I reread The Lord of the Rings every year. And it was a shock to come to the end of last year and realize that I hadn't reread The Lord of the Rings last year for some reason. I just haven't got around to it. And I haven't read it this year either, so perhaps I've read it enough now. I've read it so many times.
Lord of the Rings is on my list of only a few books that I've sort of committed to reading once a decade at least. So it's not once a year, but certainly once a decade. And actually, I'm probably about due a reread, actually. Yes, I went through quite an audiobook stage when I was in my teens, borrowing stuff from the library. And always get annoyed by the last person not having wound on the tape properly.
Young people today, they don't know how lucky they are.
I don't know they're born. So when you're writing your science fiction novels, do you need to do much research for them? And if you do, then what's the most surprising thing that you have learned?
Well, that's an interesting question. Generally, the answer I think is kind of a no. I mean, in terms of the writing, if I come back to what's the most unusual thing I've learned question, I think in terms of the writing, I know writers whose kind of praxis is to plot everything out, to draw up a detailed plan of every chapter and every character and character backstories, and to draw a map and to have everything arranged, and then to put the words on the page so they know exactly where everything's going to go. And I've tried that, and I find it just means that the writing process becomes a chore, and I'm bored, and I think my boredom then communicates itself into what I'm writing. On the other hand, I know writers who just launch into it not knowing what's going to happen.
With a blank page and go,
And I've tried that, and in that case, what happens is I just sprawl all over the place, and it's not very good. So my approach is I have a premise. I know what I'm going to start. I know where I want to end up, and I generally have a couple of set pieces or places I want to be, and then I'll write from one to the next. So there's enough freedom for me to keep myself entertained.
The gates you have to go through. But
also, after a while, you write enough novels, it becomes a bit. It's like driving a car. After a while, you stop thinking about how it is that you're manipulating the machinery. You're just able to
switch on autopilot.
Yeah. I mean, some of that.
Although that implies, you've got your brain switched off, which I'm sure isn't the case when you're writing.
Well, you say that. I don't know. I think the key with writing is it's always, without exception, two things. First, you get it written, and then you get it right. So writing is always writing and then revising. You don't just write and send it in. The revising part, that's much more kind of conscious. Then you're paying close attention and you're thinking how it works and how it all fits together. The writing part is more like automatic writing. I'll sit with a strong black coffee and I'll put some music on and I'll start writing. And quite often I'll turn around and think, oh God, like 2 hours have gone by. What happened there? So in terms of, I mean, the one advantage of science fiction, because I don't have a science background.
Right.
So I'm not, so you mentioned Paul Macaulay, who I know a little bit. Yeah. He used to be an academic biologist. He's a professional writer. Right. He has a lot of kind of professional expertise about biology and about the sciences. So he's drawing on that when he does his work. When I'm engaging science, as you have to do when you write science fiction, it's all from a position of ignorance. So everything is kind of new and kind of exciting. So the most recent book, the Lake of Darkness book, is kind of about black holes. So I was reading around the physics of black holes. I had a kind of saying, we all know what a black hole is, and you kind of think, well, I understand what's going on here. But actually, when you look into it, the physics is really strange.
Stranger than you thought, yeah.
And the topography of what that might mean, an infinitely dense point, how that fits into what we understand by space and time and topography and so on. That was really interesting.
My degree was in physics, actually. And,
really?
And there was a time where, Durham.
Oh, okay.
So there was a time when I half knew what a black hole was, but it was quite a long time ago now. No, it is fascinating stuff. Several of your books that I've either read or heard about have harrowing scenes of fighting or of warfare. And what appeals to you about writing those scenes? And have you considered on your long list of science fiction tropes to take on. Have you considered writing a full-on military science fiction novel?
Yeah, I'd be quite interested in that. I mean, the Black Prince, which you showed to the camera earlier, it's not science fiction. It's historical novel, but that's a novel about war. I mean, it's in a sense, it's storytelling. It entails necessarily the conflict. If there's no conflict, there's no drama. If there's no drama, there's no story. And fighting is just a kind of very simple shortcut to conflict, because it's literally a conflict. It's not necessarily the most potent or eloquent way of framing conflict. Some of the greatest stories are not about external conflict, but about the life of the mind, the character in action rather than the action in character rather than characters in action. But I think there's a sense in which once you have a war or something, a fight, then that frames whatever the conflict is. And this is, so I do teach creative writing at the University of London. So this comes up quite a lot. One of my students will have a really cool idea for a story, and you have to say to them, well, okay, that's great. You have to, but where's the conflict in this idea? How are we going to draw that out? How are we going to actually make a story out of this? Because no conflict, no drama, no story. That's a slightly kind of instrumental way of putting it, I think. But yeah,
maybe a bit reductive. But then conflict doesn't necessarily mean crazy eight bonkers battle scene, does it? That could be any manner of conflicting goals or intentions or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So I am partial to I'm in general. It's funny you mentioned Star Wars earlier. I was not old enough to read science fiction before that came out. So I would have been 6, I think, when it first came out, and maybe 5 or 6. And I hadn't quite graduated to reading science fiction. So I was one of the generation whose preferences were somewhat shaped by that. So I do like a good spaceship, for example.
Yeah.
But I did love the mode of interstellar travel in Stone. So no spaceship required, just a special kind of backpack. And do you recall, as a while back now, but do you recall what made you think of that? Like, where did that come from?
Man, I don't. I have to say, this is the downside of not really paying attention when I'm actually writing. As it all comes out of my subconscious. I think I did have an idea, yeah. But it is also, so always you want to avoid cliche. Any kind of writing, any kind of art, you make war on cliche. Cliche is the enemy. And science fiction is, that's a stylistic question. You want to make sure that your prose is not just a string of rubbish cliches, but it's also a question of content, and particularly with science fiction, where everything has been done so many times. Well,
we've got like 100 years of it now, don't we?
It's quite a burden. And I did an event. I did an event with another writer who I shan't name, who was just a writer of kind of mainstream fiction. And after the event, we had a drink, and it was in central London. And he said, it's great to meet you, Adam. I'm science fiction. I've always wanted to write a science fiction novel. I've got an idea for a science fiction novel, which I think I might write.
So what 59 times before.
Well, no, exactly. So he said, I've just been reading in New Scientist that the nearest stars are so far away, and we can't travel faster than light. So it would take many generations to travel there. So a starship could be a home for many generations of people. And I thought, that's a really interesting place to set a story. And I said, that would be great. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. But
you're in good company.
Quite a few science fiction writers have done that generation starship thing. You might want to look at
I've heard similar
Timeline and Steve Baxter. And he was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to read all their work. That would contaminate my imagination. You're thinking, well, I'm not sure science fiction is the right mode for you, mate, because you have to have some sense of what the backlist is and what it means in order to make.
Well, I think that is the risk of non-genre writers having a go, if I can put it that way. Having a go at science fiction is that, as you say, 100 years in, they're going to stumble across something that's been done at least once, more likely many times before. It's not always the case, of course, but that is a risk, certainly. All right, then. So I think you have a pretty good record for compelling opening lines, or let's say opening paragraphs. What do you consider important to convey in that opening gambit?
It just has to be arresting, doesn't it? It has to take your reader's attention straight away. That's the ideal. And again, it's a particular issue with science fiction, that because the world of science fiction is different to the world we actually inhabit, there's a temptation for the writer of science fiction to think, well, okay, I'm going to have to set all this out for my reader so that he or she can understand the world before we get to the story, and that's fatal. There's a Brian Stableford essay called How Do We Begin Science Fiction? And it's about that. It's about how you're able to kind of ease the reader into what is an alien world, giving them enough information so that they can orient themselves for this new world, because they're not going to be able to do it without the stuff you tell them, but not in a way that simply hits them in the face with a massive info dump on page 1. So that's all it is, really. It's just an attempt to sidestep the info dump.
I think it's a good way, particularly, I did have a project in mind one day to go through all of my hundreds, probably thousands at this stage of science fiction books and find the really good opening lines. But I did like particularly the one when it's done well, it lets you know that you're sort of not in Kansas anymore. There's something that's different, that's slightly off kilter or different. And I thought that the opening line or two in did that pretty well. Where the goat's fallen off the world. Was it? Hang on a minute, fallen off the world. What's going on? I described it at the time when I was jotting my thoughts down. It's like almost like the whole tale is dehydrated and packed into that one or two sentences, and it's like waiting to be unfurled like some kind of mad Fibonacci sequence, just kind of on like that. And I think that's a really good way to start the book.
That's nicely put. I like that. But it doesn't have to be a kind of impossibility. The opening line of George Orwell's 1984 is that it was a bright winter's day and the clocks were striking 13.
That's it. You're somewhere different. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, exactly. But actually, what he means is this isn't the UK of the 1940s. This is the continental system, which is the 24-hour system, because we're in the kind of future. But when you read it, you think striking 13. That's not right.
Well, then you've got inverted world as well. Of course, back to that again. The opening sentence of that, where he's measuring his age in miles.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is another really clever thing. Or even just, I think one of the greatest titles of a novel is Agatha Christie's Why Didn't They Ask Evans? Because it's just so, you think, well, I don't know. Why didn't they ask Evans? Wait a minute.
Who's Evans? Exactly.
You don't have to read this and find out. And what's really clever about that, going back to whodunits, is everything hinges on who Evans is. And you only realize at the end who Evans is, and that you've been misunderstanding the kind of purpose of this question, which is spoken by this dying man on a golf course. Who's
right.
Why didn't they ask Evans?
So you mentioned Dave Hutchinson earlier. So we'll, or I did, but we both did. So this question is sort of related to that. I've been enjoying the Aftermath series this year, in which you share the writing credits with Dave Hutchinson, although in different books. And part of a significant part of my enjoyment, not the majority certainly, but a contributing factor to my enjoyment of it is it's set just up the road from me. Goring is like a 10-minute drive from where I live, so I know a lot of the villages and towns that are mentioned in the book and the locations I run along the Ridgeway, and it's very easy for me to imagine that that whole thing in the 100 years after the sisters hit. So anyway, my question, after I've waffled on a bit, what degree of sort of writerly cooperation was there between you and Dave? Like, do you just get on with your own books given the parameters that you're given, or do you confer in the divvying up the story? How did that work?
Really, we get on with our own things, and I think neither of us as writers are collaborators by nature particularly, and some writers are. Some writers, that's how they work best, is when they're working with another writer. And I admire Dave as a writer immensely. I think he's an amazingly gifted writer, and we're friends. And so what happened was that we were approached by Angry Robot. They wanted a series of they approached a number of different writers to do different kinds of series. So there was a fantasy series and there was a space opera series, and for us they said we'd like a kind of post-disaster kind of aftermathy setup. We'd like 4 novels, and Dave does the first and I wrote the second, and Dave's now done the third and I'm writing the fourth. So then when we got that, Dave and I met in London. We had a pizza and chatted about stuff, and then we swapped some ideas on via email. But then basically he sat down and wrote the first of the Aftermath books, and then I used that as my starting point to write the second volume. I mean, it is, I don't know, maybe I wonder how it would have been, because I'm reading this China Mieville, Keanu Reeves collaboration. You wonder, was that a collaboration? Did they sit down in the room together and thrash ideas out, or did Keanu Reeves, as one of the biggest movie stars in the world, just say to China Mieville, "Here's my premise, write a novel, please"?
I really don't know. It'd be intriguing to find out. He strikes me as being a pretty smart guy, Keanu Reeves, that is, but I don't know if he's a writer. So yes, it would be interesting to know how much of it is China and how much of it is Keanu.
But that was, I mean, the collaboration would be, so Dave wrote his novel and then he sent it to me and I read it in manuscript, and well, I could say I gave him feedback, but it was kind of perfect already. So then I wrote the second novel, I sent it to him, and he gave me some kind of notes and said, well, I'm not sure this works, and I'm not sure it fits to give it the first novel so well. So then I revised it, and then we've done the same process. And when I've drafted the fourth novel, I'll send it to him and we'll see how it all fits together.
Good. So I'm glad to hear there's another part. Is that's it? It's a four book job, is it?
That's all we've contracted for. Yeah, I don't know how successful they've been, and they haven't climbed up the bestseller list or anything like that. So I don't know if it's
my biggest bugbear at the moment with that series is that they changed the artwork, so the third one doesn't match the first two.
That is annoying, and I don't know why they do that. It's like
it's just like my shelves are full of non-matching series. It's quite upsetting for the completist, but I'll get over it, I expect. No, I have really enjoyed those, so I'm looking forward to that. When do you think that will all be hitting the shelves?
Oh, now you're asking. I don't know. I think I'll probably finish a draft of it by the end of the year, so it will go next year, I suppose, 2025 maybe.
Often a year later, isn't it? Maybe. Yeah. Okay.
But there's a story about Charles Dickens, who published his, not that I'm comparing myself to Charles Dickens. One day I hope to be like Charles Dickens, dead. I mean, there was a story about him, because he published his novels in monthly installments.
Yes.
And about he was in a bookshop in London, and he overheard a woman asking the bookshop owner, "Do you have the latest Charles Dickens?" And the bookshop owner saying, "Oh, I'm afraid it's not in yet, madam." And Dickens thinking, "Oh, I haven't written that one yet. I better go home and stop knocking around bookshops and actually write the damn thing."
Good. Well, I'm partial to a good end of the world tale, and in fact, I've just done a video on exactly that. That little series got a mention.
Oh, right, excellent.
I enjoyed it, as I say, in part because it's really local to me. So there's nothing like a local apocalypse to focus your mind.
It's an interesting part of the world, though, isn't it? Because I don't live that far away, so I'm in Ascot.
Right. Okay.
And my sister lives in Henley. I published 2 novels, the closest I've ever come to a series, which are based in a kind of futuristic Reading. And no one had done science fiction set in Reading, which is strange, really, because it's really interesting.
Well, nothing very interesting much happens there. So that will be the real time there.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I did not realize they were set in Reading. Okay, well maybe I need to.
So I didn't really want to call it the Real Town Murders, but I was over pressured by my editor. They should be called the R Town Murders. R ! Hyphen town. So Reading has, in the story, excuse me, this isn't a spoiler or anything. Reading is, to try and zhizh itself up, has renamed itself R Town. R !
Has it really? Okay.
But still, and the premise of the novel is that now there's immersive VR. Most people just spend their lives in immersive VR, and Reading is kind of deserted. And there's a last-ditch attempt to try and encourage people to explore the delights and wonders of Reading.
Yeah, of which there are many. Of course, so I live on the edge of Reading, just on the Oxfordshire border, so a bit up the hill out of Reading. Yeah. Why did the thing itself not get a hardback issue? Was that like a publisher decision, or like why that one? Why was that one singled out?
I don't know I don't really know the answer. It's certainly not my decision. I'd be happy. I would like there to be a hardback edition. I'm not sure. I mean, what puzzled me is all my earlier novels were issued by Victor Gollancz in hardback editions, and then this one wasn't. But then some of my later novels have been issued in hardback editions. You're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense, really.
More often than not, yeah.
But yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened there. Presumably it's a costing thing, or they think, well, something to sell copies in hardback. Maybe. I mean, who buys hardbacks? Collectors do, and libraries do.
Yeah.
But unless you're, a massive bestseller, unless you're J.K. Rowling or something, regular people don't buy hardback. They wait for it to come out in paperback when it's cheaper. But no, I honestly don't know. It has been translated into French.
Yeah. Well, so what's it called in French? Do you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, it's called Le Chose en Soi.
So let's get on to Lake of Darkness, since that's imminent. So is it next month it comes out? I think.
Yeah, mid-July.
July. Lake of Darkness sounds like a cheery tale. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I wanted to do again a kind of mashup thing where I hadn't ever written a utopia. People don't write utopias anymore. In fact, utopias are kind of exploded form. It used to be really popular. It used to be write lots of utopias. The 19th century is full of utopian novels. H.G. Wells wrote a bunch of utopian novels imagining a kind of better future. There is a problem, I think, with utopia, which is that it goes back to what we're saying. If the world is perfect and everyone's happy, then there is no conflict, therefore there's no drama, therefore it's hard to see what the story is. So Ian Banks, you mentioned, I think he had a kind of utopian imagination, and he presents the culture kind of as a utopian space. But it's hard to tell stories that are just about how great it is to live in the culture. So,
which is why they're all about on the edge of the culture.
Yeah, they're all special operations or going outside the culture, or a war or something else is happening. So I was going to.
While we're on the topic of that, sorry to interrupt you. We will get back to the new one. There was, I thought, a touch, in a good way, a touch of that kind of culture style utopia in, which one was it? Stone. Where you've got the sort of complacent people kind of living their post-scarcity lives, and then getting disrupted by all manner of things afterwards. I thought that reminded me, like I say, in a good way of the culture.
I mean, Stone was kind of written in dialogue with Banks.
Oh, right, okay.
And reading all the culture novels, but yeah. So I thought I'd have a go at writing something utopian, kind of properly utopian. But then I thought I'd mash it up with something that was properly body horror, which I also have never done before.
Okay.
The Dennis Wheatley satanic story. So I explained the premise to my 15-year-old son, and he said, "You should call it Space Satan!" ! Again, I wasn't able to get that one past.
I deduce that something is coming out of the black hole that we might not like.
Yeah. So I mean, again, it's not really a spoiler. It's this idea that you think of a black hole as a kind of oubliette, as a kind of dungeon. You think, well, it must be the deepest dungeon in the cosmos.
Yeah.
Literally inescapable. Not even light can escape from it. So why would you construct such a prison? What kind of entity would you put inside such a prison? And that's when it kind of folds into a satanic side to things.
Good stuff. Well, I have that on pre-order, so that'll arrive whenever, mid-July, as you say. Might be holiday reading, or I might have to wait till we get back. Go a little bit more into the ways that Chris Priest's writing has influenced yours. Is it just by virtue of having read a lot of his work when you were in your formative years, or is there something that you try to emulate, or how does it work? Yeah,
I mean, there are differences, and I don't think I hope I'm not just sort of slavishly imitating the way Chris wrote. So my prose is very different to his. He writes this very deliberately plain kind of prose, but he was, I think. I mean, the first few novels the first novel of his I read was his very first novel, which was Indoctrinaire, which I had in a paperback. And then I read Fugue for a Darkening Island and Inverted World, and as they came out, I'd read the new ones. And the early ones in particular, I would read, and I found them really striking and really memorable, and they really speak to me, but I wasn't necessarily entirely sure I understood them, what was going on. And then to read all of his work, you start to see certain kind of fascinations. You could almost call them obsessions that he keeps returning to. So doubles and twins is one of them.
Yes.
The most famous of Chris's titles, I suppose, is
Prestige. Yeah.
Prestige, which was made into a very famous movie, which is about these dueling magicians and is all about twins and doubles and magic. I mean, the novel, if you've read it, I don't know, the novel is really quite different to the movie. The movie works quite well.
I tried to get myself. I tried to find. Well, I didn't try. I looked and then quickly ran away when I found out how much they were. Tried to find a first edition of that, and it's because of the popularity of the movie. It's it's really expensive, and I haven't yet reached the point where I want to drop hundreds of pounds on a book. But
no, I know it's a tricky thing, that isn't it? But so, but that, and there's something, and again, this is because we're late enough into the discussion now. I can start to be properly pretentious.
Yeah, do.
There's something poetic about what Chris does or did, not in stylistic terms, because as I say, his prose is very plain, and not in narrative terms, because he tells, absorbing stories with believable characters and so on. But in the sense that gets to the heart of science fiction. So if I'm asked to define science fiction, I'll start to talk in these terms. Science fiction is, I think, radically a metaphorical literature, because it aims to represent the world without reproducing it. Its metaphors might be reduced to familiar props and settings, and spaceships and time machines and robots and ray guns, or they might be something unusual and new. So an inverted world that's built around this idea that, kind of a stroke of genius in a way, that you and I live on a finite world in an infinite universe. What would it be like to live on an infinite world located within a finite universe? How would that work? What would that be like? And that's a fascinating kind of thought experiment, but it's more than that. It's also a novel about the way reality kind of folds back on itself, the way the kind of journey that we're on through life is one that returns us back to where we started. It's a really kind of powerful, expressive kind of metaphor at the heart of that. And that's true, I think, of most of Chris's books, and it's true of Ballard as well. I mean, it's interesting. Ballard is he's constantly returning to empty, deserted swimming pools and low-flying aircraft and camps and gated communities and kind of things that he found fascinating, that he was constantly trying to work through in his writing. And I think I don't sit around analysing myself, putting myself on the analyst's chair, or indeed kind of turning my literary critic gaze upon myself, because I think I'm a bit worried that if I did that, it would kill something in my imaginative process, which is largely, I think, subconscious as it works itself out. But I think I do have similar kind of fascinations.
Yeah,
but I don't know. I think if anything, it's a particular vibe and a particular kind of affect that the best Chris Priest novels generate, and that I'm trying to kind of do something similar.
I read Fugue for a Darkening Island earlier this year, which was quite a book. It's not really a post-apocalypse tale, but it's certainly a breakdown of society tale, and how quickly things go bad, which I enjoyed immensely. Again, it's one of those things something I need to read again.
I mean, it's formally, it's a really interesting novel formally, because it's this kind of series of quite short.
Yeah, it's all out of
sequence, and it kind of sets up. I don't know which version you read, because the first, I read it when it came out, and then Chris had to revise it because
I think I've got the pan. I'm going to wander off camera for a second here.
Okay. I'll put you on the spot there.
Yeah, that one.
Oh yeah, that's the original version. Yes. So he produced a revised version later on, where he tones down some of the stuff about Africans.
Yes.
Coming to this kind of collapsing Britain, was criticised at the time for being not exactly racist, but on the borderline there. And he produced a kind of revised version where that's
a bit toned down.
Yeah.
Well,
but yes, that's really evocative to me. Those pan paperback editions, which is where I first read the early Chris Priest novels up to, I think Space Machine was the first non-pan book of his that I read.
I have made it my mission to collect. There's 80 in this livery, not Christopher, in this pan livery. There's 80 of them, and I've got about 60 now.
That's impressive, mate. That's good.
But the ones that I've got are easy to get. The 20 that I don't have, you pay through the nose for them. So I'm just waiting for them to turn up randomly in in charity shops or whatever, and they do turn up from time to time. There's a good few of the ones that I've got now do.
See, I wonder about that as just in terms of the pleasure of collecting books, because it's so easy to go online. And if you think you like this book, you go online, you press a button.
I do get impatient. Yeah, that does take some of the
pleasure that used to be the case, where you go into a shop and it would just the book would be right there. You think, oh, that's fantastic! I've chanced upon it.
I still do a bit of that, and I found some amazing things in very prepossessing kind of branches. That's the word I was looking for. Branches of like British Heart Foundation or wherever, and they're sitting on the shelf there. For example, where's it gone? Hard to Be a God by the Strugatsky brothers, first edition.
Yeah,
just sitting on the shelf there. I paid $1.99 for it.
Oh, that's amazing.
And that's in like pristine mint condition. It was there have been a few of those, which is a joy. And you're right to say that some of the pleasure of that made redundant by being, as you say, being able to quickly go on Bookstand or abe.books.co or whatever and quickly find what you want.
But then it's also how kind of pernickety one gets. So one of the things I collect is Library of America editions.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm to read. I don't just have them, but they're all in the same
black ones with the red trim,
black and blue kind of stripe across the spine. So I've got, I think, 40 or 50 of those, various authors, and I will read them. And I've got almost all of Henry James in Library of America livery. And one of the volumes I didn't have, I looked on eBay and there was someone selling it, so I bought it. It wasn't expensive, and when it arrived, it didn't have a dust jacket. I hadn't been clear, so now it's this brown spine in amongst all my lovely.
Oh no, you're gonna have to replace it. That's all there is.
Well, but then I went online to look. I think perhaps I can just buy the dust jacket, and there are firms that specialize in producing, manufacturing dust jackets, the first editions, but they're as expensive as the books. It's a very kind of strange world. And then that's all. So I wrote a biography, a literary biography of H.G. Wells, and to do that was I was commissioned to do it, and I signed the contract thinking, well, I've read H.G. Wells' science fiction, how hard can it be? And actually it was quite hard because he wrote a lot. He started publishing in the 1890s. He published 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 books every single year of his life, and he doesn't die until 1946.
Jeez.
So there's a lot to read, and it meant I had to read a whole bunch of stuff, and I hadn't realized quite how much I'd set myself up for. But there's a really interesting kind of disparity there, that if you go online to try and buy a first edition of War of the Worlds, it is tens of thousands of pounds. But if you go online, all the later books that no one's ever heard of, they are, as you say, they're £1.99. Yeah. So I've ended up with quite a large collection of H.G. Wells first editions of all the obscure H.G. Wells titles that no one's ever heard of, but they're still first editions. Are you thinking?
Yeah. And you're a big cheese in the H.G. Wells Society these days, if that's the name of it, something like that.
It is. I'm a vice president. I'm one of the several vice presidents. So the other, Chris Priest was a vice president. Steve Baxter is a vice president. I'm a vice president. The president is Patrick Parender, who's a Wellesian academic who was at the University of Reading, actually, but he's retired now.
Okay.
But it's
Steve Baxter's written a sequel, hasn't he, to, I've got it down here somewhere, the sequel to War of the Worlds.
He did, yeah. It's a kind of authorised sequel, although Wells is out now, so you don't need anyone's information. So
actually, I was asked to ask you this question, but it didn't make it to the list, but since we're on the subject now, I will. Of his many, many books, if you were to recommend an H.G. Wells book to somebody that had never read any H.G. Wells, which one would you pick?
So there's 2 answers to that. One is to stick with the science fiction. I mean, it was striking to read the whole run of H.G. Wells, because science fiction was a relatively small part of his kind of overall. He wrote a lot of science fiction in the 1890s and at the beginning of the 20th century, but then he kind of stopped writing it and wrote all sorts of other things. Of the science fiction, I think War of the Worlds is an almost perfect novel. It's beautifully written and it's still current. But then all of those titles where he's sort of inventing subgenres of science fiction, like The Time Machine is the first time travel story. There's one that is the first invisibility story. And so all those I think are great. They're all quite short. The first dystopia, When the Sleeper Wakes, they're all brilliant. The book that really surprised me, which I hadn't read before, was Mr. Brickling Sees It Through, which is not fiction. So that was published in 1916. in the middle of the First World War, and it's a kind of story. It's a self-reflexive story because Mr. Britling is kind of a version of H.G. Wells. He's a sort of writer living in a country house, and he's having an affair, and he's got 2 sons and so on. But it's a novel about the First World War from the kind of home front point of view, and it's just amazingly well done. It's just a brilliant novel, and no one's heard of it, let alone no one reads it. And I'm not quite sure why, because it's not like World War I literature has gone out. People are still reading Wilfred Owen's poems and making movies out of All Quiet on the Western Front and so on. And this is one of the greatest World War I books I can think of. But
what's it called?
It's called Mr. Britling Sees It Through. Okay. So Britling is like a little Brit, I suppose. I'll put a picture up on the screen when I get to editing. My H.G. Wells confession to you is that I'm sure I have read War of the Worlds, but my main memory of it is from the Jeff Wayne musical. So my dad played that to death, and it was one of the I think the first CD that we bought. Million to one, you said.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't actually listened to it for fucking decades, but I probably know it off by heart, or a decent chunk of it anyway.
But it's a really, as a kind of prog rock sort of music.
It's really good.
It is good. Although the hit single that came off it, which was Forever Autumn, sung by Justin Hayward, has nothing to do with the story of War of the Worlds. It's clearly a song that Jeff Wayne wrote and that he bunged in. Anyway, but
we went to see that
because they had a staging recently, didn't they?
It's come on and off for a number of years. We went to see it probably about 10 years ago, when the guy from the Kaiser Chiefs was the lead character. I can't remember his name now, but anyway, it was very good. Anyway, we're going massively off topic. So I did have 1 or 2 more questions, and I want to let you get on with your evening. Switching gears then. So regardless of the setting, whether it's in the far future, the near future, whatever, or current, the best science fiction often tells us more about what's going on now in society than it does about the future. What do you think recent science fiction says about the times that we're living in? What are we collectively worried about at the moment?
Well, I mean, there's the kind of obvious answers, aren't there? We're worried about climate change. We're worried about what that means for the future. A writer like Kim Stanley Robinson, I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. I've read his Mars trilogy back in the day, which I still have the hardbacks of here somewhere, but I haven't, and I've read several of his others. I have somewhere Ministry of the Future, it's up there, but I haven't read it yet. Ministry of the Future is really interesting novel. I mean, I'm a bit of a Stan Robinson fan. It's an unusual novel in that it doesn't do many of the things that a regular novel does, but it is one of the most comprehensive attempts to engage the questions of climate catastrophe and suggest ways in which we might. It's more akin to a blueprint, is what I've heard. Address it. I mean, I'm struck that I think this is still true. It certainly has been true for the last 15 years or so that dystopia has had the prominence that it has. I was saying earlier, no one writes utopia anymore, but they do write dystopia.
So it's too busy being,
and it's very, very, very popular as well. And you're thinking, well, what's the appeal of that? I don't know. Why do people? I mean, I've written dystopia as well. I'm not knocking it exactly, but from a reader's point of view, isn't it just depressing? Isn't it just gloomy and fill you with despair?
It is a bit gloomy, and it's like some of them are just thoroughly miserable. But the Fugue for a Darkening Island, for example, is pretty miserable. But I think the thing that has me going back, as well as the kind of thrill of it all having gone pear-shaped one way or another, whether it's a kind of authoritarian government or some kind of global disaster. What I like about those, aside from that cheap thrill, is there's usually, anyway, some message of hope interlaced with the gloom and the doom and the risk and the panic and the whatevers. So that's why I like them. I think we'll be all right, it tends to say, and we're glossing over the fact that billions of people weren't all right in that story, but you sort of hope.
But I mean, I suppose I'm also, like Hunger Games, I suppose, kind of ends up in that place as a series of novels and indeed movies. I wonder that, I mean, it's young people are reading this in large numbers. And I wonder if it speaks to some sense that being young in this day and age is a kind of despairing place to be. I don't know.
Lack of control, maybe. Yeah. A question about how you manage. Have you got like one of those Harry Potter time turners? Roughly a book a year for coming up to like 25 years almost, just in science fiction, you have an output that many full-time authors would envy, and yet it's not even your day job, and it's not even all that you write that isn't your day job either. So how the hell do you fit it all in? Like, how do you, I was going to say churn out, but that sounds pejorative.
I do. No, churn is exactly the word. Say that it's the mot juste for what I do.
How do you put out so many books? How does it work? Do you reserve a certain period in the year when, okay, that I'm going to focus on that in the evenings for a while, or because you've got, what I imagine is probably a pretty full-on day job as well.
So yeah, I'm a full-time academic at Royal Holloway, University of London. Yeah, and I'm actually at the moment head of department, which is quite a lot, just in terms of how many meetings and how much admin, how many emails I have to answer. They asked H.G. Wells this question, actually. They said, well, because he was also very prolific. And they said, well, how is it you write so many novels? And he answered, well, I'm an indolent man, and I'm sitting down anyway, so I might as well write something.
Might as well.
A bit like that. I think the big change for me was having kids. I love my kids dearly, but I don't know what I did with my time before we had kids. I must have had great open stretches of empty time I could do anything with. I just sat on my hands or stare at the wall. I don't know what I did. When we had kids, it really focuses your mind, because then if you have half an hour free, you think, well, I'm going to make the most of this, because I'm not going to come at it again. It also, the advantage of having kids, although it's a sort of slightly bitter advantage, is that it breaks you. I don't know if this has been your experience. I used to be able to lie in until noon, and then
I can't do it
anymore. So there's a period when you have to get up at sort of 5:30 every morning because you've got a screaming baby. And then your kids grow older, and then they're teenagers and they're sleeping through to midnight, but you can't emulate them anymore. Now I'm awake at 6 a.m. whether I like it or not. So I can get up, and it gives me several hours before I have to do anything else, when I can just write.
Well, that's when I get all my reading done, actually.
So people do ask me this, and I think the answer really is, I just really love writing. Writing is my happy place.
It's a compulsion.
I like reading, obviously, and writing is like reading, only more so, more immersive and more involving. But it is a compulsion. I'm at the stage now where I honestly don't know what I think about something until I write it out. I do my thinking with my hands on the keyboard now. I don't sit and cogitate and then think, okay, that's what I shall write.
That's interesting. Okay. So one final question, and I'm going to let you go because it is getting late. Lake of Darkness about to come out. Awesome. Looking forward to it. And then you've got the fourth Aftermath book. Have you thought through yet what you might tackle after that?
So in terms of science fiction, I've written a novel talking about compulsion, which is called Compulsion. Actually, it's called Compulsion because it's only in French, and it's illustrated by the Belgian bande dessinée illustrator Francois Schouten. Francois Schouten is not well known on this side of the English Channel, but he's a huge name on the continent. He's a kind of superstar of the bande dessinée, these kind of hardback comic books that are such a big deal in Belgium. And his publisher, Dargaud, who hitherto have only done bande dessinée, they do these kind of comics. Comics is the wrong word for them. Are publishing this as an illustrated novel. It's the first one of those that they've done.
Cool.
It's a story that I've written called Compulsion.
Did you write it in French? Because that's just showing off now.
I know. I didn't. I wrote it in English and they translated it. And I do speak a bit of French, but I don't. My facility with French is not sufficient to enable me to write fluently in French. But I mean, I was in Belgium last week. I went over there to Brussels to meet with Francois and with the publishers at Dargaud to talk through some of the last things, and looking at the kind of spreads. The images are just amazing. They're just so beautiful. Full color images, white images. And that's coming out later this year. I've written it's not fiction, but it's a history of fantasy
I've got your science fiction history. Is that in the same kind of Palgrave series, or is that a different?
It's not Palgrave, this one. It's kind of a follow-on from the history of science fiction. That was published by Palgrave. Yeah, there's a second edition which is blue, which is better and fuller.
Is it? Okay.
But not that I'm saying you have to buy more copies of my books. You've got plenty there.
Well, I find it to be really useful when I'm swatting up on. I did something on the Golden Age a while back, and I found a chapter in here about that. Terribly useful for that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. But I thought I'd do another. So the history of fantasy is Bloomsbury, not Palgrave. But that's okay. I finished that now, and I've submitted that, and that will come out. I don't know. I think again at the end of this year. And as you say, I've got to do this book, fourth Aftermath series, which I've made a start on, but it's quite hard. So in terms of I write then when I can, and I get quite a lot of writing done early in the morning. And then other stuff from the day job will generally take over much of the day. I'm generally blasted by the evening, and I'm not getting much writing done. No, I'm getting more, a glass of wine slumped in front of the telly.
Yeah, quite.
And an early night. But I will try. And it's often been the case. Kind of the shape of an academic year is that terms and you're teaching and doing everything else is quite hard to find the time, and then you get a bit more time over the summer. So hopefully I'll get some writing done over this summer.
Of course,
I've got a 2-book contract at the moment with Galance, and Lake of Darkness is the first of the 2 books. So then I owe them another book, so I'll do them a book. Yeah. I'll probably write that. I'll make a start on that later this year. So there's stuff going on.
Yeah, plenty. Well, Adam, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you taking time to speak to little old me on my not terribly widely watched YouTube channel.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
But it's been good to chat. Thank you very much.